There's been really a growing phenomenon of people, especially young people, identifying as anti-capitalist and seeing capitalism as a problem. And I wondered if you could speak to both what accounts you think for this rise in anti-capitalist sentiment, but also how popular understandings of capitalism differ from a scientific understanding of what capitalism actually is and how it actually functions, and why this distinction matters.
The problem is when people think that they're opposed to capitalism, or when they talk about capitalism, they just think of it as greed, or just, the wrong distribution of the very lopsided distribution of wealth, where like the billionaire class, has too much wealth, and there's too many people going without, which is true again, but that's just once again an outward expression of the deeper reality of how this system actually functions. And capitalism is a system based on exploitation. It's based upon a small number of people accumulating wealth from the labor of other people. That's the essence of capitalism. It's also the essence of every system of exploitation. If you think about it, if you go back to slavery, well, it's obvious that people are accumulating wealth from the labor of others. Or, even the feudal system where you had serfs and big landowners exploiting the serfs. They were getting wealthy from the exploitation of the serfs. Under capitalism, it's more disguised, because the outward appearance is, well, you go get a job and they pay you a wage, and it's an equal exchange. They pay you a wage, and then you work for them, and then they make money off of that, but you're getting a wage in return. So it seems like it's some kind of equal exchange. But really, through the process of capitalist exploitation, people, and not just in this country again, but all over the world, including these children in Africa and elsewhere, are creating a lot more wealth in the time that they're being forced to work for these capitalists than is equal to what they get paid. So the rest of that wealth is accumulated by the capitalists. And a very important point along with this is that it's not just one group of capitalists all sharing the wealth collectively or cooperatively. That's not the way capitalism works. Capitalism is a system of separate ownership of the means of production, the factories, the land, the raw materials, the machinery, the technology. These big capitalist corporations, accumulate billions of dollars through ownership of these means of production, the means of producing wealth by exploiting people using those means of production. But they're all in competition with each other because each of them is accumulating privately. So, you see it constantly. Even the gigantic corporations and other forms of capitalist wealth get driven under through the competition. And so, with other capitalists. And this is a worldwide phenomenon at this stage in the development of capitalism and this stage of human history. And so, this leads to like a lot of anarchy under the capitalist system. And that's why, things don't get produced that people need but are not profitable to capitalists, or not profitable enough in terms of their competition with other capitalists that are either in the same field of exploitation or somewhere else, but ready to pounce on them and take over from them if they don't keep up in the ruthless competition. This is what capitalism is. It's a system that's driven by this exploitation and by this anarchic competition among capitalists, which then gets expressed even on the level of countries, where capitalist states are in conflict with each other over the, areas where they can exploit people more profitably, over key sources of raw materials that they need to accumulate, more cheaply, over strategic parts of the world and trade routes. And that's why you have all these wars and conflicts and everything else. This is what capitalism is, and as I've been referring to, we're now at the stage where it's capitalism, imperialism, which means it's a worldwide system of exploitation, not just exploitation within a particular country by the capitalists within that country. They're all competing, especially the big ones, on an international scale, and this leads to all the chaos and madness, and yes, war, on a huge scale, repeatedly, because of this basic anarchic drive to outcompete each other by, more intensely exploiting people and by introducing new technology that enables them to more effectively accumulate capital. That's the capitalist system. And it leads to the fact, this is something that, it's actually, it's almost unbelievable, but it's true. Something I've pointed out before, think about World War II, which developed out of this conflict among these capitalist imperialist powers and then involved, revolutionary forces in what was at that time a socialist state, the Soviet Union. But it arose out of this conflict among different capitalist imperialist countries. And think about, tens of millions of people died in that war, and there was tremendous destruction. Not in the U.S., because the U.S. itself, although there were hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers that died, but the U.S. was basically spared the destruction that many other parts of the world suffered as a result of that war, because it was isolated from the main theaters of that war. But still, tens of millions of people died. In the Soviet Union, somewhere between around 25 million people died in that war. And that was, in fact, the major... That war that was waged by the Soviet Union was the main way in which Nazi Germany was defeated. Not by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the U.S. Army, although it played a secondary role. So there's World War II. But think about this. After World War II, with the U.S. emerging as the most powerful imperialist country in the world, replacing the British Empire as the most powerful imperialist. Since World War II, in that situation with the U.S., the most powerful imperialist predator in the world, and I use that word deliberately because it describes what they actually do around the world. Think about this. More than 500 million children, particularly in what's called the third world, or the south of the world, in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, more than 500 million children have died since World War II as a result of malnutrition and starvation and preventable disease because of the way the world is dominated by the capitalist imperialist system, with the U.S. sitting atop it all as the major predator. Just think how could anyone not just be totally, driven to want to bring about a major, fundamental change, knowing something like that, leaving aside all the other atrocities and horrors that are caused by this system. 500 million children. Think of it, and this is capitalism. This is capitalism, imperialism that is fundamentally responsible for this because of the way it dominates the world at this point.
In describing this and making the distinction between seeing capitalism mainly in terms of greed and just the accumulation of wealth versus the way you were describing with both the viscerality of what we're facing, but also the much more scientific understanding of what capitalism is, why is that distinction so important? What difference does it make to understand it that way? Because
if you just think it's greed, then, you could think that, we just have to curb the greed of some of these super rich, these billionaires and whatever. We just have to curb the greed and redistribute the wealth. And you don't understand that you can't redistribute the wealth in any fundamental term because the whole system will collapse. If you think about everything I was describing about the way this capitalist imperialist system actually works, its actual internal dynamics that drive it. If you think about that, if you try to curb the accumulation of tremendous wealth by these capitalists, and they're going to go under to other capitalists, and the whole system will come apart at the seams and will and lead to complete chaos. And that's why I say Trump is not going to bring back all these factory jobs that all these workers have been, have lost, including a lot of black people and others have lost, which isn't talked about enough, as a result of the development of capitalism, imperialism, once again, since World War II, and particularly in the last 5 decades or so, since the 1970s, when it's become much more globalized, internationalized. So, you have to get to, once again, it's like you have to get to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is the basic nature and the basic driving dynamics of the system. And you have to completely replace that system. You have to completely overthrow and uproot it, and then develop an economy that doesn't depend on two things. Doesn't depend on exploiting masses of people, and isn't driven and riven through by this ruthless anarchic competition among competing capitalists. So, you have to have a whole different foundation. You have to have an economy that collectivizes the means of production that I talked about. That on that basis can carry out a unified, planned approach to developing the economy in the interests of the masses of people, while providing not just for their immediate material needs, as important as that is on a constantly expanding basis, but also, an increasing enriched cultural and intellectual life for the masses of people. But that's because instead of this, this whole system being riven and driven by this conflict, this anarchic competition among capitalists, you in essence pool the wealth that the people are creating, and then you use it in a planned way to meet their needs, while at the same time having the basis to defend that revolution, that new society, from those who would try to overthrow it and drag people back to the horrors of the old way. So if you don't get to the root and you don't fundamentally change most basically the economy, and then along with that all the social relations that go along with this exploitative system, and all the culture that reinforces it in the most putrid ways, and all the misinformation that's pumped into people's heads to get them believing that this is the only way things can be, and you just got to go for yourself within this horrific system. You have to change all that, beginning with the economic foundation that's actually oriented to, and not only has the intention, but has the material foundation and basis to develop the economy in a planned way to actually meet the needs of the masses of people. And and this is something that I think is really important to understand, to get to the point where the question of individual survival is no longer a question for the masses of people, but because that is guaranteed. When people, for example, talk about human nature, well, that's just human nature. People are selfish, The reason people say that is it's a reflection of the capitalist system they live under, where people are forced to compete with each other in order to, to even advance individually, and in many cases, even in order to survive. But with a planned economy based on a collective ownership of the basic means of creating all the wealth of society, you can move beyond that, where that's guaranteed. And then, at the same time on that foundation, you can bring about the transformation of people's thinking to where they no longer are, quote unquote, selfish in the way they are conditioned to be under this system. So, that human nature changes with the nature of the system. All this is possible now. And not only is it possible, it cries out to be urgently done before this system, literally, puts an end to, at least to human civilization as we know it, which is a very real question. But even if it didn't do that, it creates and enforces a whole dimension of horror for humanity that is not only horrific, but is totally unnecessary.